Well, it does my heart good to look out and see all these faces. It's a bit disconcerting since you aren't unified by the usual temporal organization that our life imposes. There are faces here that I first saw 27 years ago, and faces that I first saw a year and a half ago, and everything in between. It's wonderful that so many of you would turn out to celebrate the history of this particular department. It's wonderful for all sorts of reasons, but one of the reasons is that it's a history that's worth celebrating. This is the best department I have ever been in, ever could have been in, and it was a major stroke of luck that brought Pat and me here back in 1984, and that initial lucky break simply multiplied itself as the years went by. I'll try and talk a little bit about that in the course of addressing my official topic, which is philosophy and the sciences. That's easily enough done, as you'll see in the course of the narrative. Why was it such a good department to come to? Because by accident, I understand from Jerry, not by design. Jerry Doppelt is the real source of history where I am concerned, partly because he was here ahead of me. Not by design, but by accident, this department was a zoo. It was peopled by Kantians and Husserlians and there were Rawlsians, there were utilitarians, there were ordinary language philosophers, there were philosophers of science. One of the reasons we came here, there was a lovely fellow who worked hard to get us to come, and when we came, we learned he'd gone to Chicago. This is, give me the guy's name. He's Mark Wilson. He subsequently wrote a book about this thick called Wandering Significance. And it took me about a month to read it, even though I donated 8 hours a day. It was a wonderful department because there were so many different points of view represented, so many threads in 20th century philosophy that were amply and ably represented by people in the department. And because we all lived in the same place and had our offices cheek to cheek to one another, this is over in Revelle College back then, we had to talk to one another. We were all young enough that when it came to be 12 o'clock, we'd go over and have lunch together. And there were all sorts of accidental circumstances that brought strange bedfellows together, or what would have been strange bedfellows. Henry comes to mind because he was, even back then, a very prominent Kantian scholar. Fortunately, Pat had done Kant as her principal great at Oxford, and I had studied under Wilfrid Sellars, who taught me the virtues of Kant. So we understood Henry right out of the gate. And though we might have been really alien creatures to Henry, given what we did, philosophy of science and philosophy of neuroscience, he at least had that Kantian dimension to reach out and touch to, so we didn't look too alien. They also cooked awfully good dinners on the occasional weekend, and we would go over and have dinner with them, and they also played golf. That's one example, but there were many. Jerry Doppelt gives a second example. Jerry Doppelt is a philosopher of science, as is well known, but he was also, at least at that time, still is, a moral philosopher, a social philosopher. And that in itself was unusual. How many people did I know who were both moral philosophers and philosophers of science? I could count them on one finger, namely Jerry. So Jerry, though he pursued his own enthusiasms, could talk to me and could talk to Pat. And similarly, throughout the department, Dick at least was a quasi-utilitarian, quasi-naturalist in ethics, so we could talk to him. Those were our inclinations, even though neither of us worked on moral philosophy at the time. Although I must say, at this point, Pat has, in recent years, don't draw in your breaths too swiftly, become a moral philosopher. And in fact, I'm holding up a book that was published from Princeton University Press 4 weeks ago called Brain Trust, What Neuroscience Tells Us About Morality. And as I'm speaking right now, she is speaking at Duke in Raleigh-Durham at a conference on neuroethics. And that's pretty much all she does now, is the neuroscience of social, ethical behavior, social bonding, kin affection, and so forth. Turns out to be a very, very rich field. And it's another instance of how one of the natural sciences finds itself creeping into philosophy to raise the level of discussion, at least in meta-ethics. As I said in one paper, and I'll repeat it again, we needn't fear that the neurosciences are going to affect an imperialistic takeover of moral philosophy. That would be like expecting cognitive neuroscience to take over the natural sciences. You're still going to have scientists in order to work and discover scientific knowledge. You're still going to have moral theorists and political theorists in order to decide what's good public policy. But we can understand the mechanisms that underlie the cognitive dimensions of moral thinking and moral character and moral learning. That is going to be a happy infusion of science into philosophy. And there are many other examples. The history of this department is perhaps the most striking example in the country of a 3-decade period in which a vibrant and variegated philosophy department profited from input from many of the other sciences. This campus was singular even back in the early 80s for having very thin interdepartmental barriers. Linguists talked to psychologists, psychologists talked to people in the computer science department, people in the computer science department talked to linguists, we all talked to neuroscientists. And when Pat and I came along and sort of made our way into that community, hello, can we come to lunch too? Sort of a, sure, come on in. We found ourselves learning on a weekly basis from people in computer science and psychology and neuroscience and linguistics and on and on and on. There was an interdisciplinary watering hole called the Cognitive Science Seminar, which had no official standing at all, but it met once a week, I think on Friday afternoons. It was run by David Rummelhart, who was in the psychology department at the time. And it brought people from the Salk Institute. It brought Francis Crick, for example, who switched his interest from DNA to the brain just about that time. And it would bring people from all of the departments that I've listed, including Pat and me from philosophy. And occasionally Jerry would show up, and occasionally a graduate student would come along. And that was an interdisciplinary seminar where you learned what the linguists were doing this last 5 years. You learned what people in artificial intelligence were doing the last 5 years. You learned what psychologists were doing once they'd escaped the straitjacket of behaviorism, which had apparently imprisoned the early years of the psychology department in this institution. And when they could be encouraged in their apostasy by 4 or 5 other disciplines, it was really kind of a rip-roaring ride. It was fun to be there. You felt as if something was happening, and it was. And if in a particular 2 or 3 month stretch nothing much was happening for you, something was happening to, say, Jeff Ellman over in linguistics, who had put together a neural network model that could discriminate between grammatical sentences and ungrammatical sentences, something that the Chomskyites had argued was impossible for anything except a classical rule-driven system. This was an artificial neural network that learned a very simplified, but still a recursively generative grammar, and that excited the hell out of just about everybody. partly because Chomsky ruled the East Coast like Tutankhamun or something like that. And people who didn't get jobs at the East Coast universities fled to the West Coast, and they were scattered up and down the California coast, for example. That was a wonderful example of the sciences influencing one another. I guess maybe that's the great story there. They were influencing one another. It wasn't as if they put the whole thing together just to influence philosophy. But it certainly influenced Pat and me. Pat in particular made connections with the neuroscience department. And the neuroscience department at UCSD was, even then and always has been, the premier neuroscience department in the entire US. And so she learned things that she could never have learned anywhere else. She was already learning neuroscience when we were in Winnipeg. She went down to the medical school and drove people nuts in ways that I shall spare you. But it was much, much more, shall we say, rewarding. Although she did catch the initial bug there, and I caught it very shortly thereafter. This is an example of the sciences influencing philosophy. It also ran in the other direction, to the dismay of some of us at the time. This department has a long history of gifted graduate students. And once we became a well-known zoo, we were at least a potential landing site for students of any ideological stripe. They could come here and have at least some mentor, some company amongst the other graduate students. And we brought to this place lots of good graduate students. And Pat in particular was keen to get some of them who were interested in the philosophy of mind or the philosophy of psychology. She was keen to get them connected with some of the psychology labs around here, or a neuroscience lab, or across the road at the Salk Institute. She would try and get somebody a position for, if only a quarter, as a lab assistant or a hanger-on, and they would learn some first-hand neuroscience, some first-hand psychology, some first-hand linguistics. Where am I going with this? I'm going the following place. Some of those students became so enamored with the novel discipline that Pat had introduced them to that they said, I think I'm going to switch my PhD to psychology, or I'm going to switch it to cognitive science, or I'm going to switch it to neuroscience. I love working in that lab so much, I'm going to stay there. And they've agreed to take me on as a graduate student because I had a bachelor's degree in biology, so I met some of them. And Pat took this with some equanimity. She was thinking, well, fine, that's good. I was trying to count the number of graduate students we lost to the sciences. This is a flow from our department into the sciences, and I can remember at least 8 graduate students over the 27 years that we've been here, some of which we were really sorry to lose, some of which went off, got their PhD in neuroscience, and then came back to philosophy. I'm here thinking of Adina Roskies. I don't know if you people remember Adina. That goes back a long way. She ended up being the editor of Neuron magazine, a very prominent neuroscience journal. But she's now doing philosophy in some department. I've forgotten quite where. In fact, I think she's at the conference that Pat's at this very day. But she's an example of enormous successes. Now, we've lost track of at least half of these people. We remember their names. But Pat would worry about this. And of course, so would some people in the department. What are you doing? We're losing some of our best students. You're shoving them out the door. I remember Pat and Philip Kitcher were especially worried here. That's a good student. We don't want to lose them to the neurosciences. And I would reassure Pat, it's okay, Pat, they're going to infect the relevant sciences with philosophical questions, philosophical expertise. They won't be quite so naive as they might otherwise have been, these other disciplines that were. So if I'm drawing satisfaction in cross-disciplinary fertilization here, it didn't just run in one direction. It ran in other directions as well, both through our graduate students and through the nature of the interdisciplinary work and the interdisciplinary publications that we all of us managed to produce. Now, we had some influence on the other members of our department. They at least learned, I think, fairly quickly to tolerate and have a sort of grudging pride in these lunatic science enthusiasts bouncing around the department. And I would play golf with Avrum Stroll and with Henry Allison. And Henry